So big welcome back to my channel, folks. More than 150 of you are new, which means that you are in luck because I've got a very special video for you today. I'm here with none other than Cameron, who you will, I'm sure, know from his YouTube channel, Cameron F1. Very big welcome to you.
Thank you.
And we're collaborating on a very important topic, which is the effect of porpoising on the long-term health of F1 drivers. Now, for a very important topic, you need a very important guest, and that is exactly what we have done. So we are joined by Grace McKenzie, who is currently studying for a doctorate in sports science at the University of Arizona, Tucson, has worked as a sports science technician and data analyst with professional sports teams, including the San Francisco 49ers, the Uruguay national soccer team. Wait, I'm not done.
Let's go.
And aside from that, Grace was a 4-year NCAA athlete out of McNeese State in Louisiana, during which time she was an indoor track champion and a field All-American and won multiple conference championship titles on top of being an Irish national pentathlon record holder. Okay.
You're really hyping me up. Like, I need everyone to know I'm really just an average human now.
I will say, though, more impressive than any of those accolades is that she's my sister. So that's obviously, that comes out number one. Like, that's just on top for everything. But welcome, Grace. Buzzing to have you on my channel to chat with us today.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I'm excited. Nervous, but excited.
Grace, first question then. What are the basic effects of the level of vibration that F1 drivers are currently experiencing on the back of this phenomenon, the aerodynamic phenomenon that we're calling porpoising?
Yeah, so I guess I'll preface things with, although Sarah gave me an amazing introduction, I am not an official scientist. So just in case anybody wants to like hop on my back about things I put out, this is just research that I found, literature reviews that I've been able to catch, and like my interpretation of the data. So this is just kind of my understanding out here. So the vibration was an interesting experience as I was looking into things, and I've always been a fan of F1, but I've never been quite as in-depth as the two of you probably, and much of the listeners today. So it's interesting to look at it from more of the scientific view. And we were chatting just before we got started about this long-term effect of the vibrations and everything that's going on. So I kind of dove in first to kind of get a proper understanding of what is the vibration, what is the G-force stuff that we're looking at. So G-force is actually, I'm going to get nerdy for just a quick second, so hold on with me. So G-force is actually not a force. And I think that's an important thing to look at because we've all kind of gone down that rabbit hole. It's a characteristic or a variable of a greater force, which of course we're talking about gravity. And that means basically your mass times your acceleration. So in the context of Formula One, your G is the acceleration of gravity. So your vibration, that's your up and down in a machine. And right now we're talking about porpoising. That would be a function of frequency. So you're looking at your acceleration. And in the context of Formula One, like I was saying, that's the acceleration of gravity, the vibration. And we're looking at the hertz. So if we hone in on vibration, we're not only increasing the acceleration that's produced by Earth's gravity in respect to the object that it's acting on, but in this case, we're talking about the car and the driver. So that trailed off a little bit, but it's a fascinating concept when you think about the damage or possibly positive effects it's having on the entertainment side of things, but physiologically what it's doing to the drivers. So to loop back, just like we were talking about before, we were talking about kind of closed head trauma and brain trauma, and that's kind of how we dub them now. I was reading an article by a publisher, Varney and Varney, and this was in 2010. So you have to think like how far we've come in 12 years and the speed of adaptations, and of course safety concerns that people have addressed, like the FIA. But brain injury without head injury is the big highlight about, okay, can we have repetitive brain injury without having a head trauma? And that's where we look at closed head trauma versus sustained injury. So when you're talking about head trauma, you're talking about your concussions, your head-to-head collisions, your crashes that you often see as in your qualifiers, your practices, and your racing. And strangely enough, or maybe interestingly enough, people are saying that that sustained brain injury caused by things such as the high levels of vibration that these drivers are experiencing can have the same neurological and neurophysiological effects long-term for these drivers. So that could cause a lot of like central nervous system, peripheral nervous system damage in the long term.
Yeah, so definitely like something that I think, you know, this happens a lot in Formula One. Something is a really big deal and then it sort of ebbs away and, you know, you move on to the next big deal. But I think genuinely, obviously there's directives and, you know, research happening all the time with this, but I really think that this is something that we are going to have to figure out for the sake of the health of these drivers in the long term. And I suppose what would be really interesting to look at as well is to figure out, obviously this has been seen in other sports as well, like you have rugby, you have the NFL, like basically any sport that involves some kind of collision. And it feels like there should be lessons that we can learn from other sports about this kind of issue. So is there anything that you can kind of point to there that F1 should be really like sitting up and paying attention and maybe even making changes?
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest mistakes you make, and I know I made it as an athlete, it's like the brain's just a muscle, like anything else. You have to train it, you have to adapt it, you have to treat it well, you have to rest it, you have to let it recover. Like, people forget that these kinds of trauma, like, they cause your micro tears, vascular tears, and that's all physiologically happening. And that happens on an everyday basis. You get up out of bed, some of us it's harder than others, but you just do that any day, and like that's going to cause little micro tears. So that's all stuff that needs to be addressed, and especially with this effect. In the context of other sports, I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole of talking too much about, like you mentioned, NFL and rugby and like padded sports and non-padded sports. I think it's a very interesting topic. It's the sexy topics, as we call it in science at the moment. Like, everyone wants to talk about what's hot and what's not. I thought I'd kind of go down the mainstream avenue, go a little bit left, and actually talk about what's popular, well, probably a couple of weeks ago in the media, but Maverick, Top Gun Maverick, it was box office hit, like it's going off the wall, going off the charts. And ironically enough, it was Dad that actually pointed me in this direction. But I was looking again, just circling back to the G-Force situation, and like, that movie is sick. And I don't know if most of your listeners have seen it, or like if you've watched it, but I had a great time watching this movie. And if anything, just for the entertainment level alone, and how well, now I'm no pilot, Air Force or anything person, but like how well they depicted the effects of the training and the effects of flight at that high G-force. Just like throwing out some stats, like fighter pilots can manage up to 9 Gs for up to 1 to 2 seconds. That is micro. And I think you've seen the movie, like they go up to this high G and they're there for a couple of seconds and they're disoriented, they're losing vision, like everything starts to go black, like you're out of there. A sustained 6Gs can be fatal: disorientation, interruption of sight, blood pulled and pooled to the legs and arms. And if you think about the stress that the drivers are under, if you're pooling all that to your legs and your arms and all that blood is rushing out of your brain, like that's a lot to take on, not to mention you're staying in control of the vehicle. And even fighter pilots, they have a mechanism where they wear kind of like restrictive clothing so that it kind of pushes that brain back up to the blood-brain barrier to keep that circulation going. Drivers don't have that I know of. Like, I couldn't find anything on it. They may, I would love to be corrected on that or informed if they do, but at the moment there is nothing that I could find. But I thought the coolest part of this was, and this is kind of interesting because it refers back to that not the closed head trauma, because we could look at concussions, impact and all that, but again, I want to kind of stay streamlined on these drivers are typically not, we see crashes, but they're typically not hitting anything straight on with intention. So I started reading this book, and it's a man called Eric Seed, and this was again 2013, a long time ago. But he was looking at kind of 2 aspects of things, and the first, and they just blew my mind. The first was that through the corners, just corners alone, which there are lots of, we know, in each course. Some more intense than others, but through the corners, going through the motion of an average drive, there's up to 4 Gs of force being exerted. That is just to break it down, that is 4 times of one's body weight, give or take, being loaded on the person, including the car. So if you take your average race car driver, their weight is about 70 kg, 155 pounds, and that driver, while driving, is taking on up to 617 pounds of weight, 40 kgs of which are just on the head, not including the weight of the helmet. And that is like, this is ridiculous. That is twice the current squat world record for the same weight class and category. And bear in mind, when you squat, your barbell is on your back, you're going up and down. These drivers are going multi-directional. So that's just off the charts to think about that intensity. And the second thing that he said was physiologically, and this is probably the carrot in it for me, is that physiologically you can't train currently to adapt to this kind of physiological stress. So there is no training to where you can accustom yourself to that level of gravity. It's almost unearthly. So right now, this vibration, this increased heart rate, this muscle tension, and this PNS, CNS risk that we're putting these people at, it's not something you can teach or something you can retrain yourself to adapt to. So going back to those fighter pilots, going back to your drivers, you can adapt the body to many things, but as of right now, there's no concrete literature that I could find to where you can adapt to this. So you can repeatedly expose, but it doesn't mean that you'll adapt.
Wow.
We saw that with Nico Hülkenberg too, right? Like he hopped in for Sebastian Vettel at the start of the season, and like he was walking around with like all these like heat packs, like ice packs on his neck.
Yeah.
I can't deal with this anymore. Like it's too much. And the vision thing that you mentioned as well. I mean, we've seen like the onboard cameras, right, where they're approaching a corner and there's so much vibration that even people like Martin Brundle on commentary are like, I don't know how they're spotting the apex. Like I genuinely, I don't know how they're doing this. It's crazy.
Which is absurd when you think about it, because the whole point, like from my understanding of the porpoising, the whole point was to increase efficiency when taking over people, right? So like see your target, get around them, like avoid all the dirty air coming back. Like if I can't see them anyways, what's the point?
It sounds a bit dangerous, eh? It does sound a bit dangerous. So go on then, Grace. What do you think? I mean, if you put your clinician cap on, what do you think of the solutions that the FIA are proposing to institute, and to what extent do you think they will solve for the porpoising issues that loads of teams and drivers are facing?
I think at the moment, the way the solutions they've provided are concrete. Like they're providing a somewhat solution while still providing the entertainment factor, right? So as someone that's probably not as much of an invested fan, but I still have a lot of interest in the sciencey part and like the sport itself. My understanding is that this does tail back the damage a little bit, but it's still going to put it out there, because they're race drivers. They want to go fast. They want to make money. They want to have big races. They want to have an entertainment factor. And that's completely understanding. That's sport. That's the name of the game nowadays. Safety, while we like to glam up safety and make it sound like it's the biggest concern in things that we do nowadays, we all know, like, we have the fanciest helmet, the fanciest cars, but like everyone wants to see a good race at the end of the day. I think what's been proposed by the FIA is quite concrete to the degree that they can add something. But I think it's funny because we were talking about this just before we hopped on, and I was like, it's interesting that it's the drivers, of course, whose safety concern is primary to them. So they're coming to the campaign and they're like, what can we change? What can we do to increase the safety to ourselves? But it's then you kind of read in the papers and the headlines about like how it's the managers that are going back and forth bickering about like, oh, well, they did this to fix their car and they did this to fix their car. So who else is concerned about the driver? Because like, are the managers concerned about how it looks and they're concerned about cheating? Like, are they concerned about their driver? Are they concerned about how the management does it? Like, I was kind of intrigued. Maybe that's just like the little dramatic side of me that was kind of like, oh, I don't think they care about the driver. But I think at the end of the day, obviously we want the voice to be the people that are behind the wheel. Whether that is the case right now, I'm not really sure. I'm not 100% convinced, but I think the propositions that they're making are going to help solve the aerodynamics issues. But I do think it's going to be a step forward to take a step back. I think when the costs do come, whether that's in speed, accidents or whatever, I think that push to kind of go back to getting the advantage is going to come back, because we have seen a positive effect in how they drive. Yeah, we're seeing negative effects maybe physiologically, but we're seeing the entertainment factor go up. So that itch for that might come back.
It's interesting, right, Grace? And this is the argument that I keep having with my mates. Who's ultimately responsible here, right? Because the drivers surely have a duty of care that they owe to themselves. Lewis could have parked up the other day when he was having those issues and just said, sack this off. I can go fast, but my back's bloody hurting and I'm getting a headache. So sack this up. I'm not doing it. Toto Wolff ultimately owes Lewis and George a duty of care, and he could have sacked it off and they could have run a higher ride height. The FIA obviously owe the drivers a duty of care. So it feels like this multi-pronged responsibility, liability problem. And I don't know.
Absolutely.
It's tough, right? I don't know who I'm going to ultimately point the finger at and say, well, if somebody gets injured or has some like lasting damage physically, then
who could have avoided it?
X is the problem. And I think they're all kind of partially to blame in it a little bit.
That's how they're getting away with it though, isn't it? It's the like ambiguity of who is responsible. Everyone's just pointing at the other. It's like the Spider-Man meme of like the three.
Oh yeah.
The other, it's like, no, this is on you. And the other guy's going, no, it's actually on you. Like, I think until somebody steps up, and personally, I think it should be the FIA. They're the governing body. So like, if it's an issue that is affecting enough, maybe not all, but like a vast majority of the teams and the drivers, and it is like a human health issue, I think that's where like, that's the whole point to me of having a governing body, right? Is that like, there are some problems that you shouldn't have to govern yourself, especially when you have a vested interest that's worth like hundreds of millions of dollars at the end of the day.
I think it says a lot too that like, these are extreme athletes. Like, these are people that are already enduring the maximum bodily demands and physical demands. Like, they're willing to be dehydrated up to 6 to 10 liters of bodily fluid as you go, 90 minutes of extreme endurance. And that's outside of the training times, the general stress, the general recovery, like your qualifiers. This is just one aspect of a long list of demands they're putting on themselves. So for them to be like, red flag, it must be quite bad.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I suppose if you take it back to brass tacks, though, porpoising in its rawest form that the teams and drivers are experiencing it is an easily solvable issue, right?
Yeah.
Don't raise the ride height and don't go so fast. That's your solve. That will always be the panacea. So in that sense, then it's kind of like, well, I don't know. I agree with you, Sarah. The FIA kind of have to police and save the drivers and teams for themselves ultimately. But I don't know. It just feels a bit, I don't know. Bryson Sullivan on Twitter said a really good thing. If the number of teams that don't suffer from material porpoising enough to injure a driver seriously is greater or equal to 1, then it's on the teams, right? It's on the teams because they haven't done a good enough job with their design concepts and are now risking the health and safety of their drivers. And I just add, finally, whilst I agree with you, Sarah, ultimately the responsibility and kind of like the burden needs to be on the FIA. Sarah, me and you both been watching F1 long enough to know the incompetence and the consistent inconsistency of the FIA. Don't bank on them to do anything at all, because they're so. Mohammed bin Sulaim today talking about how and again I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, tweeting about the spirit and camaraderie of F1. Meanwhile, there are women at the Red Bull Ring being abused and catcalled and fearing for their safety. So again, that just gives you an insight to exactly the extent to which the FIA are so inconsistent and bloody incompetent, quite frankly. But I digress. This is a porpoising conversation.
No, very good point. I feel like you could build that into any conversation at this point, and it's still relevant.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I suppose, Grace, like as a kind of underlining point of the whole conversation, like in your opinion, if you had to, I don't know, maybe if it's like a rating on a scale or whatever, like what is the actual level of risk for these drivers right now if we don't do something that actually makes a difference? Like, is it going to be materially detrimental for them?
Being perfectly honest, it's so hard because there's so many contributing factors to these drivers' risks. Like, you could, if you're going to if you put the stats up and you see the chances of a fatal crash versus porpoising currently, the fatal crash will probably come out on top every time. So the odds of that happening might be 10 to 1. I think because it is something like you guys have outlined, it is something that we can fix. It is something that we can adapt to increase safety. I think it's something that doesn't need to be an unnecessary risk. It doesn't need to become a statistic. It's avoidable. How avoidable is telling people whose sole purpose is to drive fast, to drive slow, going to be realistic? Probably not very. Therefore, the risk is always going to be posed. I don't think it's going to be the game changer. I think it is playing a big part right now, but I think it's just going to be another factor. It's going to be on the list. I don't think it's going to change 100% the safety levels of the sport.
Putting it on the line, not sitting on the fence.
Which is a bloody shame. Great. I suppose. I mean, we had a couple of big incidents last week, right, in F2 and F1. So the Nissani Hauger incident in F2, which I'm convinced the Halo was responsible for saving at least one life, and then similar circumstance with Sonoda and the Halo. And it just feels like, I mean, even the halo, Sarah, you'll remember, I'll put my hand up. I didn't really want the halo. I wanted the cars to look all sleek. I wanted the cars to look all sleek and beautiful. I was saying, well, there's danger inherent in F1. And it just feels like not just the FIA, but the F1 demographic are always kind of like a little bit behind time or behind the curve, even in terms of our approach and attitude towards safety. And I hope, fingers crossed, touch wood, that this isn't a similar instance, that somebody doesn't have to get injured because of porpoising in order for us to then take it seriously and institute the proper measures and consult, like yourself, Grace, the proper clinicians, because the FIA just, mate, not capable.
And I think that's the thing too, like the halo, we saw that change happen. Like, what are we going to see happen? It's still very early days. So what are we going to see happen? What changes are going to happen to the car? Like, we're talking about a piece of wood or plastic right now and holes and diameters, but like, what are the changes that we're going to see as the season progresses or as it closes out and the next season comes around? Like, what are the drivers going to change? What are the mechanics going to change? So I don't think it's a clean and cut situation. I think we're going to see a lot of adaptations, because one problem arises, another problem goes away, another one comes up. So I'm sure that it's going to have domino effects. It'll be interesting to see what they do.
Yeah, 100%.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now the ever evolving Rubik's Cube, Grace. I couldn't agree
Absolutely.
more. Yeah.
That's so scary.
Because I suck at Rubik's Cubes.
Just a tad. But
I genuinely feel like we could go on about this for hours. It's just even just the science side of it, adding it in, like from kind of the spectator point of view, is just so interesting. But unfortunately, we will have to leave it there. A huge thank you to both of you for joining me for this conversation today. It was definitely very interesting and educational as well. Drop a comment below to let us know what your reactions are to this. Although we do have science, so bear that in mind. But yeah, Cameron and I'll be hanging out answering your questions when the video goes live. And until then, take care and enjoy your racing.
Thank you, guys.